Hello everyone. So in this next section we're going to be talking about judgments, decisions, and reasoning. And so in order to get us started, I just want to provide a very brief introduction to the idea of judgment, decisions, and reasoning. And specifically in this introduction, I just want to start off by providing some definitions. And as we'll see here in a minute, these definitions can get a little tricky, but I at least want to provide some broad general definitions to have you start wrapping your head around the big idea that we'll be talking about in this particular section. So when it comes to reasoning, we're really talking about the process of drawing some sort of conclusions, or basically looking at our options and thinking through the different options that we have. Whenever we talk about decisions, we're really talking about the process of making choices between alternatives, and so deciding between some of the different alternatives that we have. And in the case of judgment, it's really the process of making some sort of a conclusion. Now, one of the things as we go through these definitions, and you might have even heard it in me trying to provide additional definitions to these, is that all of these concepts are highly interrelated. And so we typically think of this as one thing, and one of the ways that we might kind of summarize this is just, oh, this is all just thinking. And this is a little too simple of a definition of just the process of thinking, but that's really what this chapter is about, is kind of dividing up these separate things of reasoning, decision making, and judgment, and talking about those. So I realize this is a really unsatisfying definition, but hopefully it at least gets you to start thinking about some of the differences between the three of these, and also provide some broader context of what we're really kind of getting at whenever we talk about these three ideas independently. But one of the big things that always comes up in this chapter, anytime this is talked about in cognition, is the idea of reasoning, and specifically two different types of reasoning. And you've probably seen or heard of these two different types of reasoning before at some point in your life, and that's our old friends inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. And whenever we're talking about inductive reasoning, we're talking about moving from very specific observations to very general conclusions. And whenever we're talking about deductive reasoning, we're talking about moving from general ideas to very specific conclusions, confirmations. Now, I'm going to go into much more detail between these, but one thing I do want to say before I go into the details of these is that we like to kind of set these up, and you'll see this as we go through this entire section, we like to set these up as two opposing things, and even here in the slide I use the verses to set these up, and it's really, really unfair. If we talk about science, later I'm going to make a suggestion that deductive reasoning is really the heart of science, and the next slide I'll say inductive reasoning is. The reality is that science is really inductive and deductive reasoning. And also, as I go through these ideas, hopefully I'll give some everyday common life examples of how we use inductive and deductive reasoning. And what you'll see is that these two work together really closely with each other. In fact, a lot of times we go from inductive to deductive reasoning and vice versa. And that's common in science. That's actually, honestly, how these two apply to science, but also in the everyday aspects of our lives, wherever we use inductive and deductive reasoning. So bear with me, it's helpful in the student mind to separate these as two different things. From a testing perspective, it's nice to separate these as two different things. And I think, really the heart of why we separate these as two different things is to make sure that they're very clear and separate in people's minds. However, the way that they play out in the real world is actually very interrelated with each other. But let's go ahead and start off by talking about inductive reasoning. And again, I really like this just short phrase to help people remember what inductive reasoning is, of going from specific observations to general conclusions. And so, for example, if we're talking about a psychological theory, it might be that we have some observation. Let's say that we work in some sort of a care clinic, and we notice that a certain type of people, say people with Parkinson's disease, are more likely to have depression than people with some sort of other disease, so let's say Alzheimer's. And so as we make that observation, we notice that this is a pattern, that it actually holds up over numerous people, that people, again, the more people that we see with Parkinson's disease, we notice that they have depression, whereas the people with Alzheimer's that we see they don't have as much. And this actually leads us to generate some sort of a hypothesis. In this case, depression might be more common in people with Parkinson's disease, and maybe it leads us to a very strict theory, even maybe a biological theory of why people with Parkinson's disease might show more depression. It might be some interaction between the dopamine system, which is impacted by Parkinson's disease, and the serotonin areas of the brain, or serotonin production. And I'm just doing this one off the cuff, so I apologize. It's not well thought out. But the idea here is that we're going from our everyday common observations, and we're moving those ideas towards theory. Now, we do this in our everyday lives also. So one of the examples I like to use is, let's say that we sit down and we go to turn on the couch, and we go to turn on TV. We hit the remote, the power button on the remote, and the remote doesn't go on, right? Well, one of the things that we may have noticed in the past is part of the reason, or some of the reasons that the remote doesn't work is it may be out of battery, or it might the batteries might be dead in it, that there might be something blocking the connection between the remote and the TV, and let's just work with those two. So we've made those observations, and so we can go from seeing that to moving to some sort of theory. Now, in this particular case, that concept of just making these observations of what in the past has created problems for using the remote control on a TV, those would be inductive reasoning. And maybe it's led us to, after going through this process, to develop the theory, okay, remote controls need working batteries in order to be able to work, or remote controls need a clear pathway between the remote control and television in order to be able to work. So that's the idea of inductive reasoning. Another example, I'm a little hesitant to use this one because I've tried it in classes before and it's never perfectly panned out. But let's say, well, I'm a big fan of zombies. I'll just be honest and not hide my nerdom. But let's say that we just find ourselves suddenly in a zombie apocalypse, and we have these zombie creatures that are coming to us, and we're really trying to figure out how do we stop these zombie creatures. And so one of the things, we're going to observe a bunch of different things. Maybe we throw rocks at the zombies, and most of the time when we throw rocks at the zombies, nothing happens. However, we do notice that if we tend to hit them in the head, that the zombies stop and no longer coming after us or attacking us. And then let's say that we eventually find a weapon, and after we find that weapon, we find that if we shoot zombies in the body, that they still continue to keep coming after us. However, if we create any sort of damage to their brain via a gun, then it's going to stop the zombies in their tracks, and they're no longer going to attack us. These observations where we're doing something and we're seeing the outcome that it has on zombies, or we're noticing some sort of a pattern here, is going to eventually lead us to, well, maybe what we need to do is try to basically aim for the head. Right? And so it's going to lead us with this aim for the head hypothesis. And if we notice that this seems to work over and over again, it may lead us to generate some sort of theory about how it is that we can actually stop zombies from attacking us. So in that case, we're using inductive reasoning. We're going from specific or individual observations that we've had, and it's leading us to big conclusions about how to effectively use a remote control with a TV, levels of depression in people with Parkinson's disease as opposed to Alzheimer's disease, or in this last case, the zombie situations. Hopefully that clarifies inductive reasoning for you. Now, deductive reasoning is the opposite. In the case of deductive reasoning, we're moving from general ideas and we're moving to specific conclusions. And so this is more typically what we think about when we talk about the science of psychology, where there's some sort of an existing theory, and based off this theory or this idea, what it would predict or what this theory hypothesizes is XYZ, and if that's the case, then we should be able to create the situation where XYZ happens. If we create it and we notice some sort of a change, then that confirms our theory and suggests that our theory is at least supported, to use the words of psychology. However, let's say that we go back to our TV remote thing. We might have theory about how TVs and remote controls interact with each other. And so if we run into the situation where we sit down, we push the power button on our remote, and the TV isn't turning on, this might lead us to generate hypotheses. It may say, okay, well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check the batteries and see if the batteries are dead, or more honestly, what we do, since we're already sitting down on the couch, is just roll the batteries a little bit, and hopefully that's enough spark to at least be able to get the power on the TV to turn on, and then we'll change batteries the next time we get up. Now, if that, once we move those batteries around, what we're going to do is we're going to hit the power button again and see if it turns the TV on or not. If it doesn't turn the TV on, then what we're going to do is we're going to go back up to the theory level, and we're going to say, okay, another thing that I know can get in the way of TV power turning on is that there's something in between the remote control and the TV. So in my case, sometimes one of the cats is sitting right in front of the sensor on the TV. So what I'm going to do is shoo the cat and try to make sure that pathway between the remote and the TV is clear. Once that's clear, I'm going to test it again, see if the TV turns on, and hopefully if I get confirmation by the TV turning on, then that's going to suggest, okay, clearly what the problem was that it was something blocking, in my case a cat, the sensor, and so there was an incomplete path between the remote and the TV. Let's say, in the case of zombies, that we have some sort of a theory. So we've noticed that there's this pattern, and our general theory is that it just requires some sort of damage to the head in order to be able to stop a zombie in their tracks and stop them from attacking us. And so this may lead us to a certain hypothesis. Maybe that hypothesis is that it's not necessarily it doesn't require any necessary damage to the brain, but actually if we remove the head, then that will also stop, or if we basically disconnect the brain from the body, that will also stop the zombie from attacking us. And so what we may do is, this is getting very Walking Dead. I haven't seen Last of Us yet, but we might collect a sample of zombies and cut off this is gotten really dark. Cut off the heads of a bunch of zombies and see what happens to them, as opposed to whatever the appropriate control in that situation would be, cutting off their torso. And so based on those observations, if we do find that the group that we've cut off the head and the zombies seems to stop more zombies than just cutting off the torso, or whatever the appropriate control might be in that situation, then what we can say is, okay, well then clearly there's support for this idea that any sort of damage to the head, or disconnecting the body from the head, is what's going to be able to stop a zombie in its track. So hopefully, kind of approaching that from a common everyday situation, a scientific approach, and then also from the zombie approach. I apologize, got much darker than I had intended it to. Clearly I watched too many zombies movies, but hopefully one of those is you're able to use to kind of help you differentiate this difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. And I want to come back and just say again, remember that these two are interrelated with each other. Often the way that these play out in the real world is that we don't just do inductive or deductive reasoning, that there's actually some interaction between them. And we'll talk about this more as we go through some later slides, but I at least want to set up the rough ideas for you, so that you understand the differences between them, but realize that sometimes when they play out in examples that you might create for yourself, it might get a little confusing, especially in these middle steps of here in the slides. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, please feel free to reach out to me and ask any questions that you might have. And I'll actually stop the introduction here and create a transition so that we talk specifically about inductive reasoning.